Hi, my name is Sarah Fetterman. I'm a graduate of the doctoral program at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and I wanted to share with you today a presentation I gave at the annual Law and Society Conference in New Orleans, because I think the topic extends far beyond academic interest. And I came to this work actually out of advertising. I had a very different career, and I spent a couple years roaming around Europe. I was living in Europe at the time, and I saw the trenches from World War I, where almost every French family lost a son. I saw notebooks filled with the 25 million names of Stalin's victims. I went to the death camps, and something just shifted in me that I felt like we just can't do this again. Humanity just can't do this again. And of course we are doing it again in many different ways. So my research that I'm sharing with you today is an outgrowth of a really personal experience of transformation and change in my priorities. So I want to share this and hopefully influence some of the discourse that we're having today about the violence that we're seeing. So the talk that I'm giving today is social construction of ideal perpetrators and ideal victims. And I want to make this as accessible as possible. What I'm talking about is mass atrocity, genocides, large crimes against humanity involve lots of actors. We know that. It requires the participation of the masses. Unless you're dropping an atomic bomb, there's lots of people involved. And we have something called the International Criminal Court at The Hague, where one perpetrator tends to stand for all, right? One person is declared guilty, and that expunges the collective. Now, a lot of people think that that's a great idea because it prevents a blame cycle. If you start blaming everybody in a community, then it's very difficult to move forward. But at the same time, it really skips over the question of how are we going to decide who becomes the fall man and who is expunged? Who's the guilty and who's the innocent? It's not always the guiltiest that hang from the gallows. We sure know that. And what I'm talking about today is that perpetrators are actually socially constructed. It's not haphazard who we pick. It's not necessarily the most guilty. And I want us to look at who's also being expunged. This is coming out of the work of Max Weber, who talks about ideal types. Ideal types are abstractions, right? So nobody is actually the perfect victim or the perfect perpetrator, but we make them into abstractions so that we can talk about them. And I'm going to use that concept today to talk about the way we construct innocent victims and guilty perpetrators. Now, the problem with these constructs is that it separates them, right? As I said, they're an abstraction, which means that they're not actually lived experiences. So we make people evil in ways that they actually may not be, or innocent in ways that they may not completely be as well. So that distorts our view of conflict and how we respond. So what this paper is working to do is to make the framework of how we talk about perpetrators much more visible. Victims as well, but there's been more work done around victims and less around perpetration. Why do this? Why make this visible? Well, otherwise, stories get very distorted. This is some pictures I took at the Communist Museum of Treachery in Jakarta, and it shows Sukarno willingly handing power over to Suharto in Indonesia. And as many of you know, that there was a genocide in 1965 in Indonesia that grew out of this. But the country's history is stored in a very particular way in the country today. And if you don't make the framework visible, other people are controlling how we understand victimhood and perpetration. Why else should we make it visible? Why else talk about how we construct perpetrators? Well, one is that a lot of other people are hiding in the shadows who had a large part in the violence and who could participate in future violence. The other is that we can't look at the norms in our culture or the values that actually might be perpetuating violence. If we just make one person responsible, then it's not us, and it's not the way we're living, and it's not our values, it's just one bad apple. So I want to get out of that bad apple metaphor. And there's no reflexivity, right? Again, how our culture or maybe past foreign policies may have contributed to the situation. So that ultimately creates a false starting point from which to solve conflict. And what I'm very concerned about is that when you start dividing groups into good and evil, pure and not pure, impure, you start dividing. You want to say, okay, well, who are the problem people? You start to separate them, and then that creates a space for totalitarian responses. So we're seeing this right now across Europe and even the United States of trying to say who the bad people are, separate them, keep them out, and then dominate. So we've seen this many times in history, but that's a very problematic approach. All right, so who is good and who is evil and who decides, right? So ideal victim and ideal perpetrator constructs. So I'm going to start with the ideal victim. The victim is recognizable. So Niles Christie, who wrote in Criminology, talks about it's the person who we recognize as instantly a victim. We'll talk about that. Pure innocence, right? The idea that there's no way in which they were corrupt. They're victims of Child Holocaust survivors are a great example. Talk about that. These ideal victims don't cause suffering to others, and they're not threatening. So Holocaust victims, especially child survivors, are a very good example of ideal victims. Ideal in the sense that they were children at the time of the war, they were being persecuted for something they didn't even know they were. Most didn't know that they were Jewish, or many didn't know they were Jewish. Not that Jewish was a problem, but that was how it was constructed, right? And then what I'm arguing is that in order to have ideal victims, there must be ideal perpetrators. So this grows out of Niles Christie's work and also Ram Hare, where there's roles. To have one, you have to have the other. So in order to match this ideal victim, who is the ideal perpetrator? What I found in my research is they tend to have some of these qualities. One, that they're abstractable. They're not ordinary. So it's not an actual person. An ideal perpetrator needs to not be someone that we can feel like is our neighbor or our cousin, right? The kind of action that they've been involved in represents the overall crime, not just one small aspect. We'll talk about this. They tend to have a sponsor shining a light on them, somebody who's really after them perpetually. That keeps, so if you can think about Kony 2012, if you ever saw that YouTube campaign that went viral. So abstractable, what do I mean by that? Nazis are much easier to attack and to hate than, say, children of the Hitler Youth, right? Young kids who were born at the time that Hitler was rising to power, who found themselves part of the Nazis. The other is that they represent the overall crime. So Hitler represents Nazism at its core, and Adolf Eichmann represents the final solution. Sponsors. So who is a sponsor? So this is a picture of Serge and Beat Klarsfeld, who are Nazi hunters in France, and they've dedicated much of their lives to both uncovering what happened during Vichy France, but also going after a number of the perpetrators. And in fact, they got people to trial, Klaus Barbie and Paul Trouvier, all the way in the 1990s. So it took them years and years to do that. But because they constantly had the light shining on them, they held them accountable. So I'm going to illustrate this idea of ideal perpetrators through the case of the French National Railways, the SNCF. This was the subject of my doctoral dissertation and forthcoming books and articles. A bit of background, but very quickly. So during the French-German armistice in World War II, when France surrendered when Germany entered, they requisitioned the French National Railroads, as well as the communication devices. So the Germans then took over the French National Railways. And the SNCF, the French Railway, continued to transport people, coal, but also all kinds of armaments, and eventually deportees that went to the German border, where a German train driver took them to Auschwitz, most of the time Auschwitz. So about 75,821 were taken. Jews were deported to death camps. A number of other prisoners were as well. And about 3,000 to 5,000 returned. So fast forward 75 years, the SNCF, the French Railway Company, has gone on to be a huge success worldwide, and it bids for a number of contracts in the United States, and including in Virginia and Massachusetts, Florida, and so on. There were lawsuits that were going after specifically the SNCF for its role in the deportations during World War II. And then there was legislation that went after specifically the SNCF. So not other railway companies that had a role in deportations during the war, not other Holocaust-implicated companies, not other companies that are currently involved in crimes against humanity, just this one company. So that became very interesting to me, and many people asked me, well, why is it just the trains? Why are we just focused on these French trains? So that led to this question of ideal perpetration. So I'm going to be looking at this model on the train company. And again, I'm not saying that the SNCF is not guilty. I'm just saying the way in which there's been a singular focus on this railroad makes us wonder what's happening in the background to keep them in the foreground. As we said before, the attributes of an ideal perpetrator is that they're abstractable, not ordinary. They represent the nature of the overall crime, and they have a sponsor shining a light on them. SNCF, abstractable, very much so. It is a train company. So that's two things. One, it produces trains, which are the representation of mindless machines, right, with no compassion, with no soul. And it's a corporation, which we abstract, right? Who do you hate if you hate a corporation? Is it the shareholders, the agents, the executives, right? So it's something distant, so it's easy to detest and make them wrong. And they represent the core of the atrocity. So Raoul Hilberg, who's considered the father of Holocaust research, said, many companies and many groups had a role in carrying out the Holocaust, but the trains were indispensable at its core. So the Auschwitz had 42 parallel tracks, just to give you an idea of how many trains were involved. And while of course there was many shooting of Jews and others during the war, just in order to kill 6 million, that many, it would not have been made possible without trains transporting them all to killing centers. So trains were really key. And they have a sponsor, right? So there's someone who's been after the SNCF. And so Aitken Gump has some lawyers who have been after the company continuously since about 2000 or so to make sure that they pay and have a certain amount of public shaming. So what's the impact of this idea of this perpetual focus on one perpetrator rather than looking at the whole system? Well, one is that we've completely polarized the conflict, right? So now we have either people who are for Holocaust survivors or people who are Nazi sympathizers, right? It completely polarized this conflict. And people really signed on to it, and it had a lot of momentum in the United States. One of the impacts is the so-called perpetrators lose a legitimate voice. So here's Guillaume Pepi, who's the chairman of the SNCF now, trying to give an apology or expressing his regrets for the role of the train company. But now what ends up happening is people either consider the apology just being given so the company can win business, or if the company doesn't apologize, it just proves that they were the heartless entity that everyone always knew they were, right? So the speaking is lost, so there's no real conversation happening. So we also miss the nuances, and this is a real concern when looking at any conflict, right? We make one person bad, everybody else is good, everybody's expunged, and then you just leave in place all the dynamics, all the values, and other people who can create and perpetuate this violence in the future. Here's an example of Holocaust survivors who'd actually talk about the nuances that we're missing and the ways in which this doesn't make sense. So this is Daniel, who was deported on one of the last trains from Paris to Auschwitz that left after D-Day. He said that I don't see that we can reproach the SNCF, in particular the drivers of the train. I think that the SNCF was simply under constraint, just as I at Auschwitz was also under constraint, though of course under other conditions. Right, so what he's saying is it was much more complicated. They were under constraint too. So whether or not this means we should expunge the SNCF today is a different issue. The idea is that there were many complexities that need to be addressed. The other is that we look at who is expunged when we focus on just one perpetrator, whether it's just one individual that's being tried at the ICC or it's one company that we're after. Well, then there's all the other companies that are getting away with it, right? And that's great for them. They love the focus to stay on the SNCF. Other Holocaust implicated companies, other rail companies, and then other companies currently involved in crimes against humanity. We're not having any discussions about those, right? So what the SNCF was participating in was now over 70 years ago, but there are companies that are involved in many conflicts today that we're not talking about. So what's the alternative to these ideal types, right? We love our innocent victims and we have our perpetrators. We're in a culture that privileges legalism, right, which wants the defense and the prosecution. So we have that dynamic really entrenched in our culture. So how do we respond to that? Well, the way I did that in my research on the French train was I sought out marginalized voices. That means that I looked for people that didn't represent just either the lawyers or the company. I wanted to get everybody in between that wasn't being interviewed. So yes, I interviewed survivors in the SNCF, Serge Klarsfeld, the Nazi hunter, but also Jewish organizations, a large variety of survivors. Then what happened is I was able to we were able to look together at what actually happened in the past. Then we were able to start to soften the binaries, meaning the good and the evil. It all started to get very muddy after hours and hours of talking about this. And then we start to see that the lines between us and the past are not so clear either. And then we have an entirely new starting point. So I'll be writing about this much more in my upcoming article about how we actually make this shift from just going from good and evil to a much richer way of looking at conflict. Beyond the Holocaust, and I really, myself and most of the 80s survivors I interviewed really want us to look forward. We want to talk about how these dynamics play out today. So for example, ISIS and refugees. So the ideal victim in a contemporary example would be the Syrian baby, who many of you may have seen that image of the baby on the beach, which is pure innocence, right? Obviously this child had no say in what happened. They're easy to sympathize with. The perpetrators, the ideal perpetrators, also similarly have no voice. They're also silent. But what happens when we have these ideal victims and ideal perpetrators, so the perpetrators can't speak, the victims are dead and they can't speak, is that other totalitarian responses can come in and dominate the conversation. And I want us to add voices and deconstruct that polarized position. hopefully to slow the fascist positions that are starting to sweep across Europe and the United States. We're hearing them, many people are hearing them. It's not just nationalistic, but it has a real tone of purifying, getting out the evil ones, keeping it safe for the pure innocent, without any reflexivity on ways in which we're all contributing to this dynamic. So the ideal is to, again, find alternatives to cycles of violence, and thank you for your attention.